move on from soft determinism and libertarianism, the two more free will inclined positions, and we're now going to start looking at a very deterministic position, which is hard determinism. And just like with all the other positions, what we're going to do is we're going to outline the different philosophies of hard determinism. We're going to start looking at the history of hard determinism, where it came from in history. And then we're going to explain it, giving some examples, before we shall critique hard determinism as a philosophical position. So really, to begin with all of these positions, what we're going to do is ask the question, what is hard determinism? And simply put, hard determinism is the view that determinism is true. So determinism in its purest sense is true, and that determinism is incompatible with free will. So whereas in the last lesson we looked at soft determinism being we looked at soft determinism being something that suggests that we can have a deterministic universe while also having some kind of free will within our actions. This position, hard determinism, tells us that this is not true. This cannot be the case. We cannot have a compatibility between our free actions as moral agents and also a deterministic universe. So one has to give up over the other, and hard determinists argue that it is free will that gives over to hard determinism. So therefore, if this is the case, determinism is false, and this is really, if this is the case, free will is false. Okay, the idea of having free will is false, and this is the most extreme position on determinism. This is the hardest position you can take on determinism. So let's have a look at some history and really where it comes from, the concept that it comes from. As you can probably imagine, it has some religious connotations, but we're not going to get too into the depths on that. According to Strato of Damascus, okay, the unconscious divine power acts in the world and causes the origin, growth, and breakdown of things. That's from Cicero, De Natura Decorum, number 1. And so this is an ancient philosopher, an ancient thinker, arguing that the unconscious divine power acts in the world. Okay, so we have a case for some divine entity that has some kind of deterministic qualities over our lives. It acts in the world. We would suggest that it is immanent in the world. And not only that, that this unconscious divine power causes the origin, growth, and breakdown of things. So we're referring here to almost like the life cycle of people and of animals and of plants. The origin, the birth, the growth throughout time, and then the eventual death and breakdown of things. Hard deterministic ideas are also referred to in a classical Indian text, the Gita. In this text, Krishna says to Arjuna in verse 1330, "They alone truly see who understand that all actions are performed by material nature, while the self actually does nothing." Now, this is actually a lot more explicit and a lot more blatant example of a hard deterministic standpoint when it comes to the nature of actions. Because what this is suggesting here, what Krishna is suggesting in this example, is that all actions are performed by this material nature, and that the self, the individual, the people, do nothing. Okay, and so this is a really a very explicit example of hard determinism being shown in ancient philosophy and in some ancient religious contexts. So we can see that the concept of hard determinism dates back as far as ancient philosophy. The argument of free will and determinism in general dates back as far as ancient philosophy. However, the concept of hard determinism has obviously been developed further into the modern and contemporary era. So what does the modern and contemporary philosophers take? What are their takes on this? And by modern and contemporary, you might think that that's kind of, that those two terms are synonymous with each other. But in terms of philosophy, the modern era of philosophy starts to refer really to the modern area of history, the early modern period, which is the moving away from the medieval period into the Reformation and that kind of period there. So we're talking the likes of John Locke, David Hume, 16, 17, 1800s, these kinds of eras. And then obviously contemporary era refers generally to the 20th century onwards, so the era that we live in today. So what does hard determinism look like in the modern era? So according to both philosophers John Locke and Baruch Spinoza, there is indeed a strict causality of acts. We see quotation marks here because this is a quote from these individual thinkers. Spinoza argues that men are deceived because they think themselves to be free. And that was from his work, The Nature and Extent of Human Knowledge, page 175. So what we are getting at here is that free will, not only doesn't it not exist, but it is also an illusion. Okay, people believe that they have free will, and that men are deceived. Okay, there is an illusion. By men we mean mankind, so men and women are deceived because they think themselves to be free. Moreover, philosophers like the one on screen here, Friedrich Nietzsche, argues that decisions are generated from themselves, which means that they are causa sui. Okay, and this is from Friedrich Nietzsche. So, again, this is another example of a hard deterministic stance. In the contemporary era of philosophy, American social psychologist Daniel Wagner stressed the limitations of free will on the grounds of experimental evidence for what he described as unconscious choice and action. So not only now are we going to look at just the philosophy of free will, but we're also going to see what science can explain when it comes to whether or not we have free actions. And that is something that we are going to look at in the next lesson, specifically the kind of scientific influences on the philosophy of free will and determinism. So Wagner here stresses that there are limitations on free will, and he cites the experimental evidence of people having unconscious choices and actions. So what we mean by this is it's the person who is making these choices and actions, but they're making it unconsciously, so as to suggest that it's not actually you as a person that's making these free choices, but it's just the unconscious actions of your biological self, which can be relatively deterministic. We can see, though, the concept of hard determinism is not as popular as in the modern contemporary philosophical regime as it used to be. So we should note here that while we're listing these different theories and these different philosophers that have made contributions to hard determinism over the years, the concept of hard determinism is not as popular as it used to be. People tend to go for a more pluralistic approach. So, choosing to suggest that there are maybe some aspects of determinism, some aspects of the universe that are determined, and then some aspects that are maybe left to our free actions. So, what are the problems with hard determinism? I've just mentioned that we have less popularity when it comes to determinism in the modern and contemporary era. So why is that? What are the problems with hard determinism? But one of the issues of hard determinism is relating to the concept of moral responsibility. So we're going to sort of delve a little bit into ethics here, but not too much. So an example of this is, if hard determinism is true, then that means we have no control whatsoever over any of our actions. And if that's the case, does that mean that people who commit crimes aren't morally responsible for their actions? So if, for example, you went and stole, you robbed somebody's house, or in this example on screen, say if someone was to steal a car, are they morally responsible for that act? Because if hard determinism is true, then that can't be the case. Because if hard determinism is true, then all of our actions are determined in this deterministic universe. We have no free will over our actions. So we didn't have the free choice to go and steal the car. We were always going to steal the car in a deterministic universe. And so if that's the case, then how can we be held morally responsible for these things? So if we were to take hard determinism to its logical conclusion, if we were to accept hard determinism to be true, and we'll look at science in the next lesson, maybe why there are some aspects that might suggest that it could be true. If that were the case, then surely we'd have to take our hard deterministic stance all the way to its logical conclusions, which would suggest that nobody is morally responsible for any of their actions. Now, someone can counter that and argue that regardless of whether or not hard determinism is true, we can still act and behave as if it isn't. And so in that case, in this world, you would still require people to be morally responsible for their actions, even though in reality they might not be. But then again, you can respond on the other hand again and say, well, how is that fair? So what the task for the end of this lesson is going to be is twofold. Okay, we've got two tasks to think about for this lesson. Don't forget, philosophy is all about thinking. So the first question is, does hard determinism truly mean that we don't have to accept responsibility for our actions? So I've just touched on it very briefly a second ago. And then the second question is, research someone called Clarence Darrow. And this is a very important real-life example of someone using the concept of hard determinism in argumentation, specifically in court, to try and get somebody off charges of murder. So if you want to have a look at, go a little bit deeper into hard determinism, have a look at Clarence Darrow and the case that he had, been a part of.